Welcome back to the March for Science Earth Week Media Zone. I'm Rania Batrice, Interim Executive Director at March for Science. And for those of you who have been following along, you know that the main pillars we focus on at the organization are justice, public health, democracy, and of course, climate. So many intersections when it comes to each one of these pillars. And more often than not, already marginalized communities are the ones who are hardest hit by the climate crisis. And then there's the reality surrounding small island nations. They're often the lowest emitters and lowest creators of climate change, yet the hardest hit. And as we look to what's going on and what it's going to take to tackle this climate emergency we're facing, we have to have real conversations about what those solutions look like. That includes things like public-private partnerships, investments from corporations, and all of the things. One of the people leading the way on this conversation is the founder and managing partner of FullCycle. It's an investment company accelerating the deployment of climate restoring technologies. Welcome, Ibrahim AlHusseini. So happy you're here with us today.
Hi, Rania. Good morning. Hello, audience.
So we have a lot to talk about, and some of it's complicated, some of it makes perfect sense. But before we really dive into it, I want you to talk us through your journey, your background, what brought you here to this place, to this space where you're so focused on addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, it's a very good question because it happened very organically for me. My family are Palestinian refugees who ended up in Saudi Arabia. So I was born in Saudi Arabia and experienced my early life really as a second-class citizen in that country. So it was, my eyes were open to arbitrary or deliberate, prejudice early on. And that all these experiences help inform who we become as adults. So I always looked at life through a lens of injustice, whether it was towards people or whether it's towards nature. I mean, it's like I never thought of the world just belonging to us, but I wholeheartedly believe that all 10 million expressions of life on this planet all have a right to thrive and live. And it was just so later in life, when I understood climate science, I realized that we were basically borrowing regenerative capacity from the future to live in the present at the expense of nature. Do you want to know a little bit about how the organic path I took? I don't know how much time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's hear a little bit about that before we jump into the next question. I think it's important, and we all often talk about how there's a lot of assumptions made sometimes about how somebody got to where they are, and I think it's an important piece of informing all the activism and advocacy and investment, all these things. I think it's just an important piece of it. So please do share a little more.
Sure. So the city I grew up in actually is called Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, which is on the Red Sea, which, by the way, is the newest sea on Earth and the most lush in the world. Every scuba diver knows this. So when I went to college in the United States, and I would go back and visit my family, every couple of years, and I'd go scuba diving in the same spot. And that experience, watching the degradation of the quality of marine life over that decade, really opened my eyes to kind of the devastation of the natural world that we were creating. See, before climate change became a obvious, well-known phenomena above water, all the symptoms were existing below water. Like the oceans and the seas were kind of the canary in the proverbial climate coal mine. And it was out of sight, out of mind. So there was no beans and to call time out, hundreds of billions of dollars for, the price of everything going up, all commodities going up because of the destabilization of the climate, but before that, it was all happening underneath the surface of the ocean. So for me, what happened is I was just like every other kid my age, or at least the unconscious the unconscious version of my generation, who were buying into kind of the capitalist stupor, hook, line, and sinker, and was just on my path of, personal wealth generation. And to be frank, like I was very lucky and had some facility in that domain. So I became a successful serial entrepreneur. I became a successful investor in general technology. I was never exploitive in my endeavors, like that never crossed my mind. I remember I was telling a story of how one of my first businesses was a nutraceutical company, and the difference between the price of the organic food-based fermented supplements compared to their synthetic, unhealthy counterpart was about 4 cents a bottle at wholesale. And it never crossed my mind to pick the synthetic one to make an extra 4 cents. So that, that kind of what I consider sociopathic type of behavior was never part of my journey, but I was never directed my skill set towards solving something as important as what we're facing vis-a-vis climate change. So after that kind of scuba diving incident over time, I just realized that, what is the point of accumulating wealth or continuing to accumulate wealth on a planet that's dying?
Yeah. And that's unique, right? I mean, because I'm not going to make a blanket statement, because there are others out there doing incredible things, but there are also others out there who have had similar, good fortune and luck and whatever you want to call it, who don't think about things in this way. So I do just want to speak that my appreciation, I'll just say my appreciation for you. I just want to speak that there are people out there who have had similar good fortune who don't necessarily subscribe to that same mindset. So I just want to express my gratitude for your willingness to sort of look beyond what's right in front of you for the greater good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, thank you for acknowledging that. I look at all of our kind of our formation as really, obviously a product of nature and nurture, and my product of nurture had to do with coming from a Middle Eastern culture that actually thinks tribally, right? Like we don't think individually. So there is no such thing as like winning by myself at the expense of the whole. Plus growing up, like I said, in a kind of compromised environment also, allowed me to look at the world and how everything is inextricably connected. Something happens in history X amount of decades ago and what it leads to, et cetera. So as much as I appreciate the compliment about, choosing to take a path that's more holistic, that just comes from decades of formation as an individual.
Absolutely. And yeah, it sort of leads me to my next question, which I just have to tell you, sometimes when I think about the realities that we're facing and what's going to happen if we keep doing nothing, or even worse, if we keep causing more harm and more death and more destruction, it's a lot. There's a really very distinct, we talk about mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. Well, the suffering is already happening in so many parts of the world. And so often, as I mentioned at the top, is, it's the marginalized communities that get hit the hardest. And it's enough to sort of make me want to crawl under the covers and maybe just not come out, which of course, not a luxury any of us have. But the truth is, we have to keep moving forward. We have to keep progressing. And I often say, we always talk about it really is going to take all of us. It sounds like such a, catchy bumper sticker phrase. It's going to take all of us, but no, really it is.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the climate crisis can't be solved with only philanthropy or only government. That's part of it taking all of us too. It's going to we talked about before, scalable solutions that can harness market forces to achieve the ambitious climate goals they're not just ambitious for the sake of being ambitious, they're necessary. So how does FullCycle and how the work that you do, how does it play a part in the collective efforts to address what's in front of us?
It's a great question. And again, going back to the theme of, growing and fine-tuning, strategies, character, whatnot over time. FullCycle came out of my experience being a clean tech investor for 17 years. So first, I want to take a step back and just address something, because a lot of times, we don't think about the cause of the discrepancy between the emissions that modern civilization produces versus the Earth's ability to absorb those emissions, because that discrepancy is what creates global warming, right? Like it's treating our atmosphere like an open sewer where we can just dump emissions into it in perpetuity and hope nothing happens. Well, after 250 years since the Industrial Revolution, that discrepancy has caught up to us, and now we're in an accelerating warming cycle, which of course, disrupt the hydro cycle and creates all kinds of issues where, you can't grow food in certain areas become unlivable. I mean, there was a McKinsey report that talked about how, there's a band around, the equator where, 5% of the year it's going to be so warm that our physiology won't be able to sustain us. So like you said, marginalized people who have contributed the least to the problem, guess what? They don't have the money to buy an air conditioner and stay indoors. So 5% of the time, whether it's our, livestock or whether it's us as a species, there's going to be 5% of the year we're going to be keeling over because of heat, because our physiology cannot live inside of that bandwidth of warmth. So the idea became great. Well, what is the discrepancy? Where does it come from? Does it come from plastic straws? No, plastic straws are awful, right? But it doesn't come from plastic straws. It doesn't even really come from our cars, if you can believe it. There's so many. Those small individual choices make a big difference, but they're really not the biggest contributors. The biggest contributors are actually the systems that underpin modern civilization, like industry, right? Like heavy industry. That's a massive one. Things like concrete production, cement production, steel production, our food systems themselves, our energy systems. These are really big technologies that underpin modern civilization. And when we say the transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy and trying to condense that transition, the timeline of the transition as fast as possible, we need to start with those big polluting pieces. Mm-hmm. For example, it takes 559,000 cars transitioning from combustion engine to electric to equal the emissions of one coal plant. So if we're able to just unplug our, coal plants, then we get so much bang for the climate buck. At FullCycle, we call it carbon return on investment, because we use, the free market system as our tool to accelerate this deployment. Because one thing that humanity seems to agree on is that greed is a motivator. So if we can make reversing climate change or stabilizing the climate something profitable and create a risk-adjusted return profile such that we can allow every asset allocator in the world to allocate more and more capital to it, we will accelerate that transition. So, and that's what we've designed at FullCycle. We've created a specific model that chooses these large scale technologies, these infrastructure scale technologies, which is a word that I'm heartened that the US government is talking about a lot more today. And in all fairness to this administration, they do understand the problem and they're trying to solve it in really systemic ways. And it isn't just lip service. So these infrastructure level technologies, in our case, we choose ones that have the highest carbon abatement capacity. So our threshold is 1 gigaton. And I know this is a scientific community, so I can go, I can start throwing kind of this nomenclature around a little bit for listeners. And so the discrepancy between what humanity produces and what the Earth can absorb is about 51 gigatons. And a gigaton, I guess if you filled an Olympic-sized swimming pool with some of these gases, it would be 400,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of gases times 51. So we only choose technologies that can abate a minimum of 1 gigaton or more at full deployment. And we only choose ready technologies that don't have any, like they're not, let's call them like Star Trek-y cool things that one day are going to change the world. There is no silver bullet, like you said. It's going to take all of us, and it's going to take everything, So the question for us becomes, what are the priorities? Like, where do we deploy capital into sooner? Do we try to solve problem number 159, or do we solve problem number 1? Because usually if you're building a building and you don't start building floor 40 before you build the foundation. So we're super prioritized by making sure that we are choosing the highest impact technologies, and we're choosing them to be ready. We don't invest in venture level technology. Why? Because that stuff takes decades to commercialize.
And we don't have that time. I mean, that's the reality of it. But I want to go back to something you said real quick and just call it out in a very good way, that there has been in more like modern history this either or mentality of either we're going to create jobs or we're going to save the planet, either we're going to protect the oceans or we're going to put all the fishermen out of business. There's been this sort of false equivalency of we either do one or the other. But the fact, and you just said it so eloquently, this can be profitable. There can be profit on the other side of saving the planet, and so I think that's such an important piece. I feel like it's a conversation that I've had with so many members of Congress too, who also, it tends to be pretty partisan, but the fact of the matter is, if we can sort of get past our own conditioning and shortcomings and need for whatever certain money sources are, and understand that we can actually have both in a very real, authentic way, we can actually move the ball forward. And you've talked a little bit about, I'm going to ask you this next question. You've talked a little bit about it, but I want to dive a little deeper. So we like to have honest conversations here. It's not helpful, to your point. We can sort of wish that something was ready to go, ready to be scalable, ready to go to market, but we just don't have that luxury right now. And the good news is there are a lot of technologies that already exist that are ready to be scaled up, that are ready to go to market, and all of those kinds of things. But having these honest conversations really means we recognize the reality of the climate crisis that's already impacting the world in a very, very real way, as we've discussed. So I would love for you to talk from your perspective of the efforts to find and fund game-changing solutions. And what is it that gives you courage in this moment that we're in, that just sort of what I was saying, like there are things that already exist. So what is it that sort of shows you that this is not just some pie in the sky idea? We actually have a huge opportunity. So I'd love for you to talk about some of those things.
Sure. So, I mean, think about it. Think about the transition from a high to low carbon economy just as any other technical leap forward, right? I mean, we're literally running the world on 19th and 20th century technologies, and we're in the 21st century. It's like, there's a lot of wealth that got created when, from the transition from a landline to a mobile phone, from, I don't know, print to digital media. There's so many technology transitions that happened and created a lot of wealth. This is no different. It's just, and this is going to happen. And the nice thing about this is it's an absolute must-have. It's not a nice to have. It's not like, oh, gee, let's invent a way for my fridge to talk to my phone, to talk to the toaster, to talk to the dog collar. Like that can wait, right? Like, what can't wait is stabilizing the only planet that we can live on. So there's a reason why every corporation and every government is starting to mobilize towards this transition. Truthfully, they're still learning. For example, like it's like a little bit of a haphazard approach. So that approach needs to evolve because it's not prioritized and strategic. Now, I can't wait for them, and neither are any of my partners interested in waiting for the world to figure this out. That's why we built this engine that we believe is the model to accelerate the deployment. For example, you'd be surprised to learn that we don't even focus on CO2 as a molecule in our investments. Why? Because it's the weakest greenhouse molecule. It's just the one that is most prevalent in the atmosphere because it lingers around for a long time. So, the 24% of atmospheric greenhouse gases that are not CO2 are actually responsible for close to 50% of the warming. Wow. So if you think of where we need to focus our dollars on right now, obviously it's to abate the molecules in the economy that have 86 times more heat trapping capacity, like a methane molecule, 350 times more heat trapping, like a nitrous oxide one, a refrigerant, like, a HFC or a CFC that range from 3,500 times more heat trapping to 13,000 times more heat trapping than CO2. So if we're finding solutions to those, then most importantly, accelerating their deployment worldwide, we get to buy ourselves more time, like slow down this warming cycle so we have more times, for these technologies that are still being developed that don't have solutions, like how are we going to make cement without producing 2 tons of CO2 per ton of cement, or 1-to-1 when we produce steel. Like, we don't have a solution to that. So we need to find solutions to that. And that's where the early stage stuff can find the solutions. But in the interim, in the next 20, 40 years, we need to buy ourselves time by prioritizing where our dollars go. So it's great. It's great that the world is all mobilizing. Now it's about strategy and prioritization. John Foley, the executive director of Drawdown, calls it a chess game. It's like you don't just haphazardly move pieces around the board. You have to have a strategy to win the game, and that's what we're trying to implement.
Yeah, and I do want to just also point out everything that you just mentioned. This is top of mind for a lot of us, mostly because I've been in the midst of these fights here recently. But everything that you just mentioned are job creators too. Completely. And that, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs when we're talking about, capping methane emissions that are just leaking into the, they're just like leaking out into the atmosphere. So back to, I know I sound like a broken record, but it's such an important point. We are talking about solving for 2 very, very important issues simultaneously. So it's not either or. And I could just talk to you all day, but I know you've got a lot of really important work to do, and I don't want to keep you all day, although I would. But as we wrap up, if people walk away with one solid call to action, one very important piece of advice from you as we move forward in a very real way, in a substantive way, what would that advice be? What would that call to action be from you?
So first, I want to reemphasize what you said. A lot of people don't, they buy into the narrative that somehow green equals loss of jobs. If they really look at the American Jobs Act, they know that all the people who are going to be laid off from the oil and gas industry are going to get jobs capping the hundreds of thousands of brown fields that are just leaking out methane.
Orphaned oil wells too. All absolutely. I mean, it is literally hundreds of thousands of jobs all across. That's across the U.S.
And they're high paying, resilient jobs for years to come. That's just and create 19.5 million brand new jobs building the infrastructure for this next transition, which, by the way, from a competitive standpoint, the US has to do this, or else we're going to become a insignificant player on the world stage. Like, the world is moving this way, whether we do or not. So we can stay relevant, stay ahead of the curve, stay competitive, or lose our edge. This is not an option if we want to stay the United States of America, some country that is leading compared to some country that once upon a time led. So right. I want to make sure that everybody who's listens to understand this. This has to happen. Don't buy into any narrative that's being funded by some special interests trying to remain relevant as their business model becomes obsolete. It's like the landline rotary phone lobby trying to keep us from going mobile. It's not going to happen. So now, to answer your question, which is what should people do? Please vote for people who are not just where climate isn't just a clear part of their agenda. They actually happen to have the education and experience and track record to implement it, plus all the other parts of their job. Like, we have gone down a very dangerous path in these last 4 or 5 years, like actually considering people who are unqualified to represent us. This is a representative democracy. The last thing we want is people whose entire platform is to take surveys to see what are people pissed off about, and then stand there and say that, hey, that thing that you don't like, I'm just going to fix it for you, as opposed to have a much broader understanding of the world and of the economy and of science, and direct us where we need to go, not just where we happen to be unhappy with in the moment. So vote for credible people, vote for qualified people. And if you want to do something for the environment, please eat less meat. The cows produce so much methane emissions. They produce so much runoff into our waterways. It's, eat more of a plant-based diet when you can. You don't have to go vegan. You don't have to go vegetarian. Just less meat. You don't have to eat meat 3 times a day. Yeah. Get that fiber. Eat meat twice, 3 times, 4 times a week. Every little bit helps, and we would appreciate that, and the world would appreciate it, and would buy us so much more time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much again for joining us, Ibrahim, and for the important work that you're doing on so many fronts, so many levels. And thanks to everyone out there for tuning in. Until next time.
Thank you, Rania.